Our next presentation is sort of exciting. I came to Lutherans for Life about 9 years ago and succeeded Pastor Reverend Dr. Jim Lamb, who had served as Executive Director of Lutherans for Life for 20 years. So big shoes to fill. And in the 9 years of that time, we've had the opportunity to really go in some new directions. We are convinced that there is a great future for Lutheranism and thus for Lutherans for Life outside of the United States. Not that our American neighbors, brothers and sisters, are not important, but even as we continue our networking here in the States and our educational activities, we've had opportunities to reach out outside the United States, and that's what this next presentation is going to talk about. The person with whom I work most closely, besides my wife, is Pastor Scott Licht. Scott grew up in New Ulm, Minnesota. Before I met Scott, I'd never met anybody from New Ulm, Minnesota. Now in 9 years, I'm pretty sure I've met everybody who's ever lived in New Ulm, Minnesota. It's not a huge city. It's like a county seat size city, maybe 15,000, but everybody and their brother is from New Ulm. But since we're talking about Lutherans for Life being inter-Lutheran, we had Pastor McClanahan, who comes to us from the NALC. Scott was raised in the Wisconsin Synod. He graduated from Martin Luther Preparatory School, which is not in existence anymore. Is now a prison, as well as a prison back then, but they've since owned it now. They're conscious of it. Then went to Northwestern College. That's the Wells Pastor Training College. He earned an MBA and a Master of Science in Information System from Iowa State University. Scott worked in the corporate world for 30 years before combining his business and theological education experience at Lutherans for Life beginning in 2012. That means that Scott is now celebrating working on 13 years now at Lutherans for Life. He then completed his theological education training and satisfied the requirements to be ordained in the Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ, the LCMC, in 2014. So in addition to his service at Lutherans for Life, Scott is also pastor at Shepherd of the Prairie Lutheran Church in Huxley, Iowa, which is a congregation that's dual rostered with the LCMC and the NALC, which Pastor McClanahan is also part of. But Scott's most rewarding vocation is that of being husband and father. He has an adult daughter in the Des Moines area and a daughter, son-in-law, and 2 grandsons. You should ask him about those boys in Colfax, Iowa. He and his wife, Sue, live near Huxley, Iowa, with 3 horses. And that's a whole other story. Sue also has 3 adult daughters. Scott says there's never a lack of things to do, and he gives thanks for how richly God has blessed him at LFL, continues to enjoy serving through the missions of Lutherans for Life, and asks for your prayers. Scott's going to tell you about his connection with the pastors and the Lutherans in a region of India. So please join us in welcoming Pastor Scott Licht.
All right, thank you all. And right before this, I was introduced to Pastor and Mrs. Gabriel, so we have some real experts in the room. My introduction to India came about 10 years ago, and so now this December I will be making my 11th trip over. I was just there in June, and I have just come to thoroughly love the people, the culture, and just getting to know our brothers and sisters in Christ there. And so I'd like to share some of that with you this morning as this will be kind of a little different than some of the other presentations, but hopefully you'll be blessed by it, and hopefully you'll take some ideas away from here to think about ways that we can uphold one another around the world as brothers and sisters, life-affirming brothers and sisters in Christ. So, life in India. We're going to talk about life topics, but first just a little geography. I live in the central time zone, and when we are not in daylight savings time, when we're on standard time, India is 11 and a half hours away from, time-wise, away from where I live in Iowa. So you can't get much more to the other side of the world than being 11 and a half hours away, time zone-wise anyway. So a typical trip means leaving the middle of Iowa, stopping somewhere in Europe, Paris, Amsterdam, London, whatever, and then heading over to India. I like doing that just because halfway there you can get out and stretch your legs in Europe and then move on to India. Typically landing in Mumbai, it used to be called Bombay, now they're moving back to the original India name, Mumbai, or up in New Delhi, and then take up a couple more flights to get where I'm headed. I go typically to 3 geographic areas, and I'm just showing you this so that if I refer to these things throughout the presentation, you'll get some idea of where I'm talking about. So Sven, you will see a picture of Sven. He is not Norwegian, but Sven is pretty much along the coast here. Pastor Doogie is a little bit further in, and then Pastor Abdul is further south near Korakode. Manjiri, he has a Bible college that he helps to support there. So that's kind of the geography of what we're looking at. Andhra Pradesh is the state that I normally go to, and it is very agricultural. So coming from Iowa, it feels like home. They grow different things, but some of the same things, but it's still very, very agricultural, and that will play a factor when I talk a little bit about the life issues. So fruit stands everywhere as you go through cities. The little mom and pop, they'll pick their fruit in the morning and then bring it into the city to sell in the afternoon. Rice paddies, banana trees. This should look familiar. It certainly does to Iowan. It's corn growing there. Peppers are huge in Andhra Pradesh in this region. So the pepper plants growing here, women will go out in the fields and they will sit there. These women are just looking at, there we go. They're just dealing with one plant at a time, but sometimes they'll put a sheet over the plant that they're harvesting from and over themselves to protect themselves from the hot sun. After they've picked the peppers, then they lay them out to dry on these huge tarps. You can even see these on Google Satellite View. You can look and you can see these enormous areas of these peppers drying out. Here was an instance where there had just been some heavy rainfall, so all the rice that had been harvested was getting wet, so they took it out of the bags and they spread it out along the road. So you're driving literally right next to the rice that is drying out for you, and some of it may well have hit the store shelves here in the United States even. Having to slow down or stop for cattle drives is, Pastor Gabriel and his wife are laughing because, yeah, this is a very real situation. And you don't want to mess with these cattle because they are large. And then the sheep and the goats, we hear about in Scripture about the sheep and goats and discerning between one or another. In India, the sheep do not look like American sheep with the big woolly, white low to the ground. They look very much like the goats. And you look at the ears and the tail, and that's kind of, at least that's how I was told how you can distinguish between the sheep and the goats there. This, just to show you infrastructure-wise, this is kind of what the infrastructure looks like in different places. OSHA, the NEC, all of those kinds of things would not approve of the wiring. Keep in mind that the standard voltage there is 220 volts. also instead of 110. So this is a very real scenario. But at the same time, we truly have brothers and sisters there who worship in different environments. And so, yes, India is very Hindu, and the Prime Minister Modi really wants to make Hindu great again in India, and he is trying hard to marginalize the Christians and the non-Hindus even more. But there are some very strong, faithful, observant, conservative Christians there, and so I get the opportunity when I go over to preach at usually multiple churches each Sunday that I'm there. And so this is a typical church. This is Pastor Dake's church. We'll see Dake here in a little bit. The women and the men typically segregate, either by the side of the church or by front and back. The kids kind of wander around. So this is one church. This is Dake's church. Here's David's church, much more rustic. And then there are even more rustic churches than this that I've had the opportunity to visit and to preach at. This young woman will kind of help us to think about life issues also. She had, well, it started out as dengue fever, but then she developed some other bacterial, something that was causing her, basically the flesh in her eyes was just rotting away. And so at this point she was blind completely, but yet her spirit and her love of God and the perspective that she brought, and she was so blessed. You know, she looked at this opportunity that she was losing her eyesight, but yet she was so thankful to God for the opportunities that she was given, and that her blindness, now she could minister to, with, and from other people who were blind. And just her joy in the midst of this struggle was just, it was just so infectious. So I had to share this picture with you of her. I think of her often, and just, you know, when I start to feel a little bit down, I think of the joy that she brought to me and to the other people in the congregation. And so just wanted to share that with you a little bit. One of the things that before we talk about life in India, we need to understand a little bit about cultures in general. And I think that will help give us some perspective and help us frame the discussion then, because when we go into another area, we need to recognize that we come into this discussion with a certain mindset and a frame of reference. But we're guests in these other communities and other parts of the world, and so we need to understand their mindset also and where they're coming from. So in general, we're going to talk about 3 different cultures and ways of looking at the world. The first is the guilt and innocence culture. I'm going to come back and unpack these just a little bit more, but the second one that we'll talk about is a shame and honor culture, and the third one is a fear power culture. So in guilt and innocence culture, it's all about internal judgment. We in the Western Hemisphere live in this guilt innocence culture. We decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. You know, yes, Scripture informs that, and it should, but as Pastor McClanahan and as all of us have experienced, we don't always go to Scripture as the source of that right and wrong, or guilt or innocence. But even in the cases when we do, we are judging our own guilt or innocence, whether that's based on what Scripture says or whatever our worldview says. And you know, the folks who really drive me nuts, the spiritual but not religious people, you know, they're the ones who create God in their image. They still have some basis by which they judge right or wrong, guilt or innocence. And so we think about that when making decisions about things. The shame or honor culture, those are, flip side. You're hoping to do things that are honoring, but often you will do things that are shameful. Those are based on external judgments. How do the people around you view what you're doing? Is it bringing honor or is it bringing shame? And this is really, you don't recognize this until you get the opportunity to see this in action and what the differences are here. And we'll, again, as we move through life and talking about life issues, this will come into play as we recognize the differences between our culture and the culture in India and how they look at some of the life issues. Typically, it's more of a collectivist society, not necessarily communist or whatever, but it's more a shared, communal environment. Again, not necessarily politically or socially, but it is. They're thinking about the collective, rather than just my own rugged independence that people in America and in the Western Hemisphere seem to take pride in. The fear or power culture, basically those who are in fear are working to appease those who are in power. So you'll often hear about, in the Native American cultures, people looking to appease the gods. And so the gods have power over you, and so as fearful people, you try to appease or manipulate the powerful. So that would be probably not as pervasive. Really, the guilt-innocence cultures and the shame-honor culture are really the big drivers, typically of the majority of the people in the world at this time. Now, I mentioned Hinduism. And Hinduism, and I hopefully we will have time for questions, and I'd love to get Pastor Gabriel's input on this too. But Hinduism is as much a culture as it is a religion. Would that Christianity was more of a culture here. The way that Hinduism is in in India, but we also need to keep that in mind as we discuss things about India. So I'm gonna, because when I visit India, I work with, there's one cluster of churches. I showed you Pastor Swen, and so the area that Pastor Swen is in, there's about 100 LCMC congregations, Lutheran congregations in Mission for Christ. There are about 100 there. Where Pastor Doogie is, there's a little over 50. Each of them have their own orphanage, and so we're going to dive into, because that's kind of the world in which I live, the first life issue that we're going to talk about largely is orphans, and talking about what's an orphanage? What does that look like? What does ministry look like to, with, and from the orphans? And so I promised you a picture of Sven. Here's Sven. He is not Norwegian. His Sven Kumar Pulavarthi is his the full name, but he goes by Sven. His wife Arana there, and then Dake is his uncle. His mom's brother, and then David is Swen's brother, biological brother also. So these are the guys the folks that I hang out with when I go to Tanaku and to that area of Andhra Pradesh. So what does an orphanage look like? And you may have visions of what you think an orphanage looks like. Well, this in the red circle is what an orphanage looks like in Tanaku, Andhra Pradesh, West Godavari district. Up there on the 7th floor of this apartment building is that little piece of that building. That is where the orphans live that I go visit. The other half of that roof is completely open. And that's where we all play. And we play tag, and we play, volleyball with a balloon, or once in a while we have an actual ball, and yes, sometimes the ball does make the journey down to the street. But those are the occupational hazards, I guess. So that's what their orphanage looks like. Pastor Doogie's orphanage looks completely different, but we're going to drill into this one just because, for the sake of time. Here's what an orphanage looks like. The 2 bedrooms. Each of those bedrooms has a bath. Swen and Ara and I have the 3rd bedroom there, and the kitchen. The common area that I mentioned here, this is the common area, just to give you scale. So this is not the whole orphanage could fit into this sanctuary. And that's where, well, up until about 2 years ago, that's where 16 children and Swen and Ara lived. When the government got caught wind of what they were doing, they said, no, you can't have that many unrelated boys and girls living in the same space. So they have since rented another apartment. So there are 11 girls in the one apartment, the 3-bedroom apartment, and the 11 boys then live in another apartment a couple floors down in the same building. But this is that common area that I was talking about. This is taken from the front door toward the back door, and here's just the opposite direction. And you'll notice, this picture might be a little easier to see. They sit on the floor and eat. They'll have the rice and curry and whatever else, and they'll have the dal and they'll mix it together and they eat it with their hands, and that's what you do. Again, that's thinking about the culture, and again, we are guests there, so we work within the culture. Here's the outside. This was one of the trips a few years ago when this gentleman and his daughter are members of the congregation that I serve in Iowa. Doug is a dear friend of mine, one of the members of the congregation, but he and his daughter went along, and they just absolutely loved the visit. Here's an opportunity that when I go over around Christmas time, I will, boy, some of these slides are advancing by themselves. So, but take over money, and we take the kids shopping to get nice Christmas clothes. And again, think about the shame and the honor. This for a white person to come and to be able to honor them by buying them new clothes is just, this is a wildest dream kind of thing for an orphan. It's an opportunity. It's more than just the money that's spent. It is the opportunity to demonstrate that they are loved and that they are being thought of constantly by a guy living on the other side of the world that doesn't look like them and doesn't act like them. But so we get to take them shopping for clothes. Here they pretty much live then in, you know how it was when you were a kid and you'd get something brand new. You would want to sleep and live in that new thing for a month at a time if you could. And these girls practically did that. But it's an opportunity again to serve and to be with them, to honor them, and to recognize how much, or to help them recognize how much they are loved. This is the aforementioned open area of the rooftop of that building, of the orphanage building, and so that is that's one view of it in the background. Here's Doug leaning against the parapet wall that surrounds that open area, which separates you from a trip down to the street yourself. The kids quickly ran after him and told him, don't lean on that wall, because there's no guarantee of how structurally sound that wall is. So he pulled away, but I got a picture of him before he did that. One year I took candy canes to India because I had never, and it was Christmas time. So, candy canes are a big deal in the United States. So again, these are children, these are orphans who have no way of providing for themselves, who are given everything. So I gave them each a candy cane. Well, Divya here, the little girl, the first thing she did, she opened up the candy cane, she broke off a chunk and shared it with each of us before even trying it herself. And I just think, wow, what a lesson to be learned there also. Now she tried it afterwards and spit it out. She did not like the flavor of that candy cane whatsoever because it did not taste like curry, or it was not spicy enough by any means. But here's another just an old white guy sitting around playing carom with the kids. They were just joyful because somebody is paying attention to them and taking time to be with them when they don't have parents to be able to be with them. Just another kid, just being able to love on the children who are there who don't get to have that relationship. Here's Doug playing. This is the Indian Ocean, and you're just out playing in the ocean. They don't get the opportunity to go. The ocean is 40 miles away. And this one time a year, either we go there or we go up to Rajamundry to a water park, and depending, we'll alternate years, but the one chance they get to get out of Tanaku, their local town. And so here's another picture of Doug playing out in the ocean with the kids. And then here's where, I will always, especially the last several trips, I've always tried to tie in life issues and talking about life. I'll do a pastor's conference, a women's conference, a children's conference, but then also just hanging out with the orphans. If you can't really see, these are the fetal model sets. We have a set down on the LFL table there, and so I brought a set over for the orphans in Tanaku and in Gudapadu and down in Manjiri. And so being able to allow the children to be able to see the reality of that life that they once were, that what they used to look like as children in the womb, and the reality and the sanctity of life, and then to be able to talk about that. And so now these fetal models can be a blessing to the kids and not just the kids, but also the members of the congregation that Pastor Swen and Dake and David and all the other pastors in the area serve. So they pass that fetal model set around. So orphans in India, just some general numbers, statistics. I'm a numbers geek, so this stuff, I love to dig into numbers, but there are, before COVID, the estimate was that there were about 30 million orphans in the nation of India. Now, India has taken over as the #1 most populous nation in the world. There's over 1.4 billion people in India. So about 30 million. Again, that's pre-COVID. Estimates are that since COVID, there's about 25% more. So that would be sitting at about 40 million orphans. There's a variety of causes for the children to be orphaned. Poverty. Now, in the United States, we think of orphans as you've lost both of your parents. That's not necessarily the case in India. Sometimes they've lost just one parent and the other parent can't take care of them because of poverty or because of illness or something like that. Again, one or both parents is dead. One of the kids in the orphanage in Gudapadu, kind of an extreme example, but his father was killed by a tiger while he was watching this happen. It was up in the hills there, not far from Gudapadu, and so there are cases like that. But for one reason or another, one or both parents is dead. Healthcare is. It is not like the United States where we buy health insurance. There is a government health system, but is severely overtaxed. And so there is private health care as well, but you have to have money for that. And not all the people there have money to be able to do those kinds of things. When one of the kids in the orphanage in Tanaku gets sick, the congregation I serve, along with the neighboring congregation, I don't see Erica, but Erica, who's helping with registration and does the conference coordinating stuff, her husband is the pastor of this neighboring church, and the two of our congregations support the orphanage there in Tanaku. And so about 6 months ago, one of the kids, Vishnavi, got a huge abscess on her neck, and just enormous. And so, we would go to the doctor. Well, okay, except you can't just do that unless you have money to go to the doctor. So I transferred money for Vishnavi and Swan to go to the doctor so that she could get the medicine to help relieve the symptoms. And it worked, but it's, again, those cultural, political kinds of things that you need to keep in mind when ministering to people in another part of the world. Adoption is nearly impossible. In order for a child to be adopted, they have to be in one of the government orphanages. And there aren't that many government orphanages. The latest statistics that I saw were, remember, 30 million orphans, about 300,000 of them are in government orphanages. So to get into one of those orphanages, plus they will typically only keep the children from about birth until 2 to 3 years old, because after that, there's just too much more demand, and nobody wants to adopt an older child. So if you think a 3-year-old is too old, well, that's too old to be adopted there. And so they move them out, and where do they go out to? The streets. If they're lucky, they're one of the 22 kids who gets to live in the orphanage in Tanaku, or one of the 50 kids who gets to live in the orphanage in Gudapadu. So, so adoption is it's even less possible if you're from outside of India to adopt a child. They just, again, because of the shame culture, you don't want to admit that there's a problem. And so it just, they remain invisible out on the street then. And most of the kids in Gudapadu were kids that were rescued from the street in one state of neglect or another. So we're going to talk about general life issues in India. So let's look at abortion. And first I'll take statistic-wise from the world perspective. So some World Health Organization statistics about abortion. This one blew me away. 73 million abortions annually around the world. So, in the United States, it's a travesty that there's one or more than one. But, we're at the 65 to 70 million range since Roe v. Wade was decided. That happens every year around the world. So something to be thinking and praying about, that, that we, again, as I mentioned in the description that I wrote up for this talk, sometimes we think about just our little context, but it helps to take a step back also, and to recognize this is an enormous problem all over the world. 61% of the unintended pregnancies around the world end in abortion. And then 29% of all pregnancies around the world end in abortion. So 1 out of 3 almost children are aborted around the world. In India itself, in India, it is legal to abort your child up to 24 weeks. And then the rest of the statistics that I'm going to give are from the Lancet, which is a fairly reputable publication, medical journal. But they're all estimates because, again, the medical infrastructure is completely different in India. And so many of these abortions in India are happening not even within the context of a medical facility. They literally are the back alley abortions. Although medication abortion is becoming a bigger deal there as it is here. But, all right, so in 2015, they estimated 15.6 million abortions. So that's 1 year. 15.6 million abortions. And in 2015, just because when you getting statistics more recent is just really a challenge, again, because of the infrastructure. 13 women per day died in unsafe abortions. It was the third leading cause of death for women in 2021. Gender-specific abortion is huge there. Little girls don't stand much of a chance for a couple reasons. The dowry system is still in effect in many parts of India and in many families there. Also, the reality that little boys can be more productive than little girls. Now, as China is finding out, that will come back and bite you, because in order to make more babies, you need little boys and little girls who will grow up to bear children. So, yeah, so that's certainly an issue to be considering. But and if you go now, I don't read Telugu, but Swen does, my friend from over there, and he said at the entrance to virtually every hospital, it will say that they do not perform gender-specific abortions, because that is the placard that the government says they have to put on the doors. Do they do gender-specific abortions? Absolutely. They will do the ultrasound, and okay, maybe just coincidentally, this girl that shows up on the ultrasound, you decide to abort, but it still is, that is a large factor as the parents are determining whether or not to abort. For the sake of time, we'll just jump into what are some other life issues that are prevalent there. Alcoholism and drug abuse. Again, because of the poverty situation, because of depression, because of so many other factors, self-medication it's how you deal with problems. There is not the psychological professional infrastructure or the counseling, which a whole different subject, but we could, in the United States it's probably abused and overused or misused, but that infrastructure is not available. And so, and especially in rural areas, which is where I go, alcoholism and drug abuse is rampant, which then also leads to suicide. I mentioned before that this is a very agricultural area. During one of my trips pre-COVID, and I don't remember the year, but Pastor Swen wanted me to talk about, when I did the pastors conference, he wanted me to talk about suicide specifically, because there was just this rash of suicides because the farmers would take out loans to buy seed, and then there was a drought. So there was no money coming in to pay back those loans for the seed, and this happened a couple years in a row. Remember, this is a shame honor culture, the shame of not being able to pay your bills. Bankruptcy just is not even an option to be considered. The shamefulness of not being able to pay your bills was just so burdensome that the only way that they could see to deal with this was to take their own life. Which then would often, something that was borrowed from the old Hindu culture, and it's not widely practiced now, but something that was, again, this is Swen reporting these things to me, but quite often in the Hindu culture, when a husband would die, quite often the wife would throw herself onto the funeral pyre and take her own life then. Because what are the career opportunities for a 30-year-old woman? Not much. Maybe picking peppers, say that quickly, but maybe picking peppers in the field, but there are multiple things that compound so that suicide becomes just this plague, this endemic situation that's going on there. Domestic abuse is absolutely a life issue that stems from alcoholism, from poverty, from all of these other things. But again, you don't talk about it because of the shame-based culture. If a woman's being abused or the children are being abused, then they must deserve it. They must have done something wrong, or maybe they've brought shame to the family, and so therefore the husband will inflict judgment on the wife or the children. Human trafficking is huge. All of these orphans out on the street, they get picked up by traffickers. And so they will be trafficked. In the United States, we automatically equate human trafficking with sex trafficking. But that is not the case around the world. In India and other parts of the world, labor is more of a big thing, where these children will be taken to sweatshops that we hear about, and they will be making the stuff that we wear. The military, children are taken from the streets or taken from a bad environment, and they're given a gun, or in parts of the Middle East, they have bombs strapped to themselves, and they walk into the marketplace and detonate the bomb. So those are often children who are out on the streets and who are being trafficked. Disabilities are other life issues, and people with disabilities, and ministering to, with, and from people with disabilities. That's another life issue that is huge there. You drive through the streets of the different villages and towns, and there's always someone who is maybe scooting around on a little cart, or is using a crutch that was made out of a tree branch or something. And so just different disabilities, again, because of the medical infrastructure or the lack of medical care, they improvise. And so how do we in the church help to minister to people with disabilities? Which leads to the final slide and just some ideas of what to do. What can we do as brothers and sisters in Christ? And absolutely the first and the most important thing we can do is to pray for the right people to be brought, for God to bring the right people into the lives of people suffering from some sort of life issue, for God to bless them and to give them guidance and clarity and let them know that they are loved. Money is easy for us. Writing a check and just saying, okay, I did my part, that's easy, really. Yeah, sometimes it makes things a little more difficult, but okay, so you can't have your $7 Starbucks or whatever for a day or two because you gave money to the orphans in India. I'm not saying that money is not necessary. It certainly is necessary. But there are so many other things that we can do. Go on a true mission trip. We'll talk about that here in another couple points. But get involved, help support financially, but also prayerfully and through resources. Send when someone is going to India. If you can't go yourself, then at Pastor Jesse's church and the neighboring church, they make cards for the kids. And so I get to take these cards to the kids, and they each have a card with their name on the envelope. Now all of a sudden, these kids who have nothing for themselves, somebody on the other side of the world thought enough to make a card for them. And so they open it up, and I have a picture that's later in the slide deck that we won't get to today, but they're holding up these cards as if they are the most treasured possession in the world because I brought them a card, a Christmas card. So stuff like our toothbrushes. When my first trip over, I found out that these kids were sharing toothbrushes. And so the next trip, there was a local dentist who gave me enough so that each child could have 4 toothbrushes so that they could rotate every 3 months. They could have a new toothbrush, and then next year I'd bring them more toothbrushes. And so stuff like that, and plus it's something that they get to possess for themselves. Learn about the culture. Don't just assume that if we in the United States would like this particular thing, that has the same significance or lack of significance to someone on the other side of the world in a completely different culture. Learn about the culture and then respect that culture and understand what it's like there and help them to live, because that's all they know. They don't know what we're coming from. So honor them by learning about what life is like for them. And my last point, this is kind of this one, I'm half Irish, and this one gets my Irish going, is people who will go on mission trips. And the extent of the mission trip is maybe they drove through a community of homeless people. Or maybe but in the meantime, they're going on their safaris and they're doing all the other stuff, and they're staying in the hotels and they're doing all the stuff. Vet any mission trips that you're going on. If the gospel is not being proclaimed, Matthew 28, go into all the world and preach, baptize. If the gospel isn't being proclaimed, I would contend it is not a mission trip. So vet whoever you're going to get involved with, and but then jump in with both feet and both hands and your brain and everything that you have, and you will become infected with the opportunities that there are to serve in other parts of the world, and to learn more about them and become friends with our brothers and sisters on the other side of the world, and learn about life issues and bring what you know about that to them, yes, but also have the humility to learn from them and what they can teach you about life issues. Every trip I come back, and I am way more blessed than the people that I go to see. I guarantee it. They may not recognize it, but man, I sure do. And so I hope, again, this is kind of a weird presentation, but I hope that maybe this will open up some possibilities in your mind. And I hope that you will, if I can do this, you guys can certainly do this. So find the opportunities and jump in. Doesn't have to be the other side of the world. It can be the other side of town, even. or to South America or to whatever. But life is happening, and there are sins against life all over the world. And so, use these opportunities to get to share the joy and the life that God has given to us, and to share that with our neighbors who desperately need to hear that. So thank you. I'm afraid I've run over time already, but thank you very much.